again, my friends. This is the second part of actually chapter 1 of this story. You remember we left Gus looking after Belle. At that time, just those two, seemingly to be among the survivors. I'm going to read on. The emergency exit, 3 seats back. 3 seats back. He remembered that. And he found the opening. The door had seemingly been ripped apart, or maybe the stewardess, whose body lay on the floor, had managed to open it. Gus put Belle on the chute and followed her to the ground below. Picking her up again, he struggled to get clear of the aircraft and managed to agonizingly carry her across a ridge lined with tall trees. He lay her down and, exhausted, collapsed beside her. He had expected the explosion, and when it came a few seconds later, he realized that it was farther away than he'd expected. He heard a second explosion and could see trees burning a little closer now. So he managed with great difficulty to take Belle further from the crash scene. He followed the line of a ridge as it had some kind of appearance of being a sort of track or a path. He expressed to himself in his native German that he was very glad the poor child in his arms was only slightly built. After several rests and further struggles, Gus managed to find a rock-strewn spot which seemed to him far enough. The heat was stifling. He was exhausted, and he lay down again, close to her. The still unconscious young lady seemed to be at rest. He checked her pulse, which seemed unsteady. For the first time he noticed the strange bird cries of the forest. He rested. He didn't sleep, but lay there silently assessing their situation. Where were they? Somewhere in the rainforests of Brazil. He didn't have a clue where they were. Were there other survivors? He didn't know. He'd have to check sometime. But what was their chance, especially after the explosion? What was the chance of their being rescued? He hadn't got a clue. He realized that having escaped from the crash, he now had to find some way to survive, him and this girl, in this strange environment. He had to build a shelter, find food, see what of the aircraft remained that they could put to good use. Water. He knew they needed water. Only now did he think about checking himself out. He lay on his back and moved each joint and muscle in turn. He did notice that his shirt was covered in blood, but assumed that this was from the young lady that he'd rescued. It wasn't until he got up to his face that he realized that there was a lot of blood still gushing out of his head. This realization seemed to be the trigger for his being overwhelmed by shock. His vision became blurred. He started to shake and to sweat. For a few moments, or as far as he could tell, that was all. He was not sure where he was or what had actually happened. He thought he'd been in a car crash for a while. He was confused. His heart was racing. He tied a handkerchief around his head to try and stop the bleeding. He lay back and tried to breathe calmly. What I would give for a glass of gin, or even a cup of coffee, he thought. As his heart evened out, he became more aware of the poor girl beside him again. He managed to smile. She's breathing. She's alive. He spoke to the trees. Again he was aware of the strange sounds of the forest around him. He couldn't do anything right now, so he just lay there, and as darkness came, almost suddenly, he noticed a change of the sounds. As the nocturnal world came to life, he tried to assess their situation. He reckoned there was probably about 300 people on the plane. He guessed so. If he and this poor girl at his side had survived, could there be others? In the morning, and in each other's company if she was well enough, maybe they could check it out, but first they'd have to assist each other. Helping the wounded if there were any, of course, but it was a bad crash, and there'd been many dead no doubt, and now there'd been 2 explosions. Gus felt certain that some, if alive on the plane, would be dead after those explosions. He didn't spend time worrying that he'd not saved more people. He'd done what he could. But this was the hardest part. when he looked down at the young companion of this girl as they left the plane, he was certain that Duncan was dead. He would rather it had been him. Life isn't just, he said, as he often did. Hadn't he lived from 1919 until now, 1987? Was he right? Would it not be just another month until he could call himself 68 years old? If he'd been snuffed out, would it have mattered? Well, apart from a couple of neighbours who would miss him, who else would? Even Carl Muller, that he'd been on his way to visit, wouldn't miss him. He'd only miss his letters. They hadn't seen each other for many years. The young man, oh, there'd been so many young ones in that awful place. Morbid thoughts filled his head, which ached. At last he slept, exhausted, in shock, in pain. His body demanded that he rest. As he lay there, on the jungle floor, with Belle, some of the insects demanded some of their blood. As the morning came to life around them, he was woken by the groans of his young companion. At first she just groaned. Gus pulled himself up and stood beside her. Then her words became more audible. "Duncan, Duncan, where are we?" Then came some more groans. But Gus was able to salvage the words crash and then Duncan again from the mumbled conversation she was trying to make. Water. Right now, more than at any time in his life, Gus appreciated the value of water. When it escaped from the plane, as he hurried along the ridge, not too far back, he'd stepped in water, he remembered, a small running streamlet, he thought. As he stood up, he touched his head and he felt the congealed blood, but at least it had stopped bleeding. His young companion also had blood, but mostly in her hair, and it too seemed to have stopped. He couldn't really take in that he'd not broken any bones. Just a few months before this, hadn't Jimmy MacDonald down the road had a drop too much to drink, fallen down his stairs in his house, broken his neck and died before even the paramedics could get there? Had he really come down thousands of feet into the trees and only got a cut on his head? The world is not just, he said again, to a tree trunk beside them. As he looked around, he had two thoughts in mind, making sure he knew where he was. The dense forest all looked the same to him. He remembered now being a small boy lost in a German forest and how scared he'd been, and his father's anger when he came home, not that he'd been lost, but that he'd been scared. Also, he needed something to collect water in. Never in his life before had he understood the value of water piped into the home, the value of cups, kettles, bottles, bowls. He took a few steps back and bent over Belle, who was now still sleeping. He climbed the 4-foot ridge behind her and followed its line, back the way they'd come the previous afternoon. He was startled by the harsh screaming cries, and in the canopy above he could see a dozen brightly coloured flashes of red in the sunlight there, moving into the top of a tree, where they became silent. The smaller, almost thrush-like bird that flew up from his feet seemed a reassuring sight. Everything else here was so strange. Plants, the dense darkness of the forest floor, birds so bright, with calls so harsh, all so strange. As he walked, Gus slipped on the glassy stone at his feet. But steadying himself, he realised he'd come to the place of water. Just as in front of him was about a metre of ground which was soggy at the edges, and in the middle was a stream just about 2 inches deep and 6 inches across, that gently percolated over the exposed stone. He could see that at times there was more water, but it looked as if there was always some, and his instincts told him that somewhere near this stream would be a place of more water. So how could he find something to carry water back to his fellow survivor? How could he make sure it was clean? How far was he from the crash site? It couldn't be far. Crossing the stream, he followed the ridge, the line of it going for another 100 metres. At this point he was alarmed to come on the body of a passenger who just didn't survive. The poor man, he could just about determine it was a man. He was so badly damaged that Gus muttered in his native language, "Your own mother would not know who you are." Stepping over him, he could smell the burning, but when he got closer to the horrific sight, he could see that it was just a smouldering. There was a track cut through the forest as if by a giant lawnmower. It had cut a swathe through it, and there was wreckage, human remains and human luggage just about everywhere. The tract, cut apart the road by the ruination of the aircraft, was about a quarter of a mile long, and the burning had taken place toward the front of where the plane finally stopped, and along the port side of it. As Gus stood there, taking in the carnage, which included scenes worse than he'd expected, there was a smell of it all. Burning flesh. Nearby, a handbag was hanging in a branch. Gus lifted it down. Inside, amongst the usual feminine items, were some photographs. Children, 4 of them, of mixed parentage, perhaps white European and South American. The woman's passport said Maria Allenby and revealed a pretty 32-year-old woman, obviously the mother of the children. Gus sighed. Then he saw what he was looking for, a plastic box. He opened it and found it full of fishing gear. That could be useful, so he put it near the ridge. Taking another look at the macabre havoc, he marvelled at their survival. An elderly lady hanging in a tree upside down made even Gus's strong stomach heave. She was still wearing her seat belt, but a branch had pierced through her and the seat. Walking back to the stream once more, wishing he had that gin, he relocated the stream. The box was about 2 foot by 2 foot by 3 foot. Now he must fill it with some water. He knew he couldn't carry much water, so he just got into the stream under the brim of the rock and put the edge of the box so that it trickled into it. He was pleased that despite the muddy edges, the water in the stream itself was fairly clean. He estimated that there was about 5 litres in the container. He walked along the bottom of the ridge, which rose to about 8 feet, but then he found a branch conveniently growing up the slope and found an easier climb. Soon he was back with Belle. More to follow, my friends. Thank you for listening. Bye.